I'm Julia Salas, Program Manager of the New South Wales Writers Centre. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today. The intention of honouring Australian writers, the whole of the series, is to acknowledge Australian writers who have made a significant contribution to our literary culture and whose work has perhaps slipped from view. So it's an opportunity to revisit those great works, or perhaps for the first time rediscover them. We began honouring with Thea Astley, and then we moved on to Randolph Stowe and Henry Handel Richardson, and now we turn to Jessica Anderson. We're very grateful to the State Library for providing this fabulous venue to hold the event in, and in particular we're grateful to the Copyright Agency Cultural Funding for funding the series, so not just a one-off event, but they've enabled us to have an ongoing series, and we hope to continue that arrangement into the future. And I also want to acknowledge Word Travels and thank them for being here today, and they're doing the filming and recording of this event today. So we're going to start today listening to a recording of Jessica Anderson's voice, a very appropriate way to start the event. It's a radio interview that was recorded in 1987 with Beata Josephi, and they're talking with Jessica about her at that time recently published collection of short fiction, Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories. Jessica's doing the interview by phone, so there are times that you've got to listen carefully. It's not as clear at some moments, and then there are regular bips, which are some of you will remember, some of you won't. The long, the STD bips, so you'll hear these regular bips throughout the recording. It goes for about 8 minutes. And it's with thanks to the National Film and Sound Archive that we have access to this recording. So just give me a minute.
Hello, I'm Beata Josephi. Welcome to Author's Proof. In today's programme, an interview with Kate Llewellyn about her journal The Water Lily. Fitch Miller will look at Jenny Parsacker's novel for young adults, What Are You? And I'll talk about Christina Stead's recently posthumously published novel, I'm Dying Laughing. But first of all, to an interview with Jessica Anderson about a recently published collection of stories from the Warm Zone. Jessica Anderson, twice winner of the Miles Franklin Award for Tirra Lirra by the River and The Impersonators, has recently published Stories from the Warm Zone and Sydney Stories. In the author's note, stories from the Warm Zone are called autobiographical fiction. In the telephone interview, I asked Jessica Anderson why she decided on this particular mode, rather than, let's say, for autobiography or for a novel.
Well, partly because I don't have total recall, and trying to write quite truthfully, I don't believe works. You can't be quite truthful if you don't remember everything. So I tried to be truthful through fiction. Is that understandable? I tried to reconstruct the characters of my family, and I was true to those, and I was true to our circumstances. But at times I found I had to merge incidents to bring out the particular characteristics that I would like. I find it often more truthful to tell a story than to try to analyse and put layer upon layer of fact, which may drive at a very boring, long, dull and factual truth, but isn't a story, is it?
How important is your own experience for your fiction?
I think it's very important. I don't think I would write without drawing on it. But I don't draw on it directly, and I draw on the experiences of people I have known. Sometimes as a starting point, I use a person I have hardly known at all, but somehow something about that person starts my imagination working, and then they change so much in the writing that I realize they have only been the spark that triggered it. You know, they aren't the person that emerges in the book or the story.
Still, you didn't want to write a whole novel set in Brisbane at the time of your childhood.
No. I just preferred to stop when I was 9 or 10.
In fact, in the stories from the Warm Zone, stories in which the protagonist, as you just said, a little girl called Beatrice, is about 9 years old, you remark how difficult it is to remember, for example, the mother, as she was then, rather than to write her as she is now. Can you tell us more about this difficulty?
Actually, I do remember her well in all her stages. Those stories go from 4 till 9, the ages of 4 till 9. I can recall her perfectly at even 3 and 4 and all the way through until at 89 she died. And I can remember it all. I saw her alterations and her character all that time. I could easily write accurately about her through the rest of her life.
Are you going to do it?
No, I'm not really.
The Sydney stories, on the other hand, have varying protagonists, female and male, most of whom, however, are caught up in divorce and separation. What is your fascination with the subject?
Well, as you know, the laws altered recently a decade ago, and there was a lot of divorcing, including my own, which naturally made the subject of great interest to me. And I heard a lot of stories about divorce at that time, and I became interested in the whole subject, and stories were bound to emerge from that, and of course they did.
These stories, do you write them in between writing novels, while you're writing novels, or let's say the novella, was that also one of those in-between stages, or do you take them just as seriously as your other work of fiction?
Oh yes, more. They're harder to write for me.
Really?
Yes, they're hard to write.
How come?
Well, I suppose I'm used to the expansion of the novel and to go on and seek out clues to the next part in what I write, and it just grows. But in a story you can't allow it to grow.
You mean you have to know already in the very beginning how it will end?
Not quite, but you have to be more conscious of where you're going. You can't explore to quite the same degree as you can in a novel, which is an exploration.
The note in the front of the book says that you are now writing a new novel. Is that so?
Yes, I am.
But you don't want to tell us anything about it.
Well, it's a longish novel set in Sydney mainly, a little in Rome. I can't tell you much about it. It's about marriage mainly and different strands of people coming together. I can't tell you any more than that.
The new novel, when will it be finished?
Next year, I hope.
Beginning or end of next year?
Well, I hope the beginning, but novels tend to be like the ever-receding horizon.
My last question actually is, some of your writing, or I should almost say a lot of your writing, also Tirra Lirra by the river, has always a sad air about it. How come?
Well, people say that, but surely there is humour in them too. They aren't sad in their general effect, are they?
But it's a sort of general underlying tone of melancholy almost.
Melancholy. Yes, perhaps that is true. If it is, it's something I can't help.
Something you want?
No, I don't aim at all at it. It just occurs evidently. It may be something in me, although I don't class myself at all as a melancholy person, but perhaps if it comes out strongly in the books, there is an underlying melancholy in my character, but I certainly don't aim for melancholy. Actually, I often aim for a light and even humorous surface, and I'm amazed when people find them a bit sad.
There you go. So now we have the really great honour of welcoming Laura Jones, who is Jessica Anderson's daughter, to speak to us. Laura Jones is a very accomplished screenwriter in her own right. Her films include Portrait of a Lady, Oscar and Cinder, An Angel at My Table, Angela's Ashes. In 2016, the Australian Writers Guild awarded her their inaugural Lifetime Achievement Award, so you get a sense of how important she is. Laura, please join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you all for coming. I know Mum would be thrilled, although I think she'd also be slightly astonished. I was surprised to hear Mum say, and I don't want to set up an argument with her straight away, but I sound as if I'm going to. I was surprised to hear Mum say in the interview that stories were harder to write than novels. I remember stories from a warm zone as coming easily, in fact quite quickly. On her balcony with a glass of wine, she'd tell us, my husband and me, fragments from one story or another as she was writing them. I think she was able to talk about the stories because they were, as she says, autobiographical fiction. That was something she never did with a novel. She wrote, I won't say secretly, but in perfect privacy, and never spoke about what she was writing. In those early days, in the mornings, she would eat a bowl of cereal standing up in the kitchen with a kind of charged air, as if she was listening to a tuning fork, and I knew not to talk. I was particularly fascinated in the interview, which surprises me still hearing her voice from 1987, that when Mum's asked about her novels being sad, she suggests, I feel as a counterpoint to the question of sad, that she aims for a humorous and light surface. But Mum also had a passionate interest in form. She talked to me about the consolations of art. I think that light surface she talks about and the deeper shaping through form are the consolations of art for her beyond her material. The photograph of Mum with the nasturtiums, oh, it's gone, it's vanished. The beautiful photograph of Mum with the nasturtiums. Oh, okay. It's much prettier to look at than the... Oh, that's lovely, thank you. Was taken in Macleay Street at the time she was writing Tirra Lirra. She moved there in the mid-70s after her divorce from my stepfather, which she mentioned in the interview, but she had first lived there in the 30s with my father further down at the other end of Macleay Street. So it was a return to old territory for her, but this time she was writing. She had come back to Macleay Street with Tirra Lirra written as a radio play, and she hit the deck running, using it to take off into a novel. But she had written her first novel in Hornsby, married to my stepfather, and for the very first time, with just enough financial security, she wrote An Ordinary Lunacy. She was 46 when that was published. Anyone who reads Mum's work will see the importance of money in the various worlds she writes about. In fact, money and divorce and the marriages that go with it run all the way through her writing. I've just reread The Impersonators, where that's the encompassing theme. But you can also see the importance of place to Mum. She grounded her characters so meticulously. In The Impersonators is a clear and very pleasurable geographical map of Sydney that you can also read as a money map. In Tirra Lirra, the house in Brisbane is a crucial centre of the novel. Those 14 planks that open the novel and lead us up into the house are like an overture, very specific, leading Nora back into the place of memory. We can also trace repeating places in various novels. The unnamed Sydney suburb, where Nora goes with Colin Porteous to live with his mother in Tirra Lirra, could be the same suburb where Molly lives with Ken Fiddies in The Impersonators. It has the same fictional purpose in both novels, a hated place to escape from. Being here or being there, the constant pull and tug of that runs all the way through Mum's work. She lived in London for a couple of years with my father, returning home just as war had started, on one of the last ships, in fact. Then it was much later, when she made a bit of money from her first couple of novels, that she travelled again, this time to Italy as well as London. She fell in love with Rome and said she wished she had gone there earlier, in the 50s or 60s. But she was a passionate Sydney-sider, passionate in her love of it, and passionate in her opposition of what she saw as our spoiling of it. I remember standing with her on the corner of George and Market Street in a tiny, unfortunately ineffectual group to protest the monorail being built. There were only about 10 of us there. Maybe the only thing Mum was more passionate about in that way was Australia becoming a republic, and she was very, very passionate about that. I was Mum's first reader, but I only read after the manuscript was complete, with the title page ready to be sent off. I remember very clearly as a schoolgirl the thrill of the reviews coming in for her first novel, An Ordinary Lunacy. Her last novel, One of the Wattlebirds, was published when she was 78. She used to tell me that when she was younger, her mother would say, "Jess, you have no stickability," which made her laugh and still makes me laugh, because she proved her mother absolutely wrong.
Thank you, Laura. So we're now going to turn to our speakers. Geordie Williamson, Michelle de Kretser and Anna Funder will each speak about a certain area of Jessica Anderson and her work. And then we'll also hear a reading from Pip Smith, an excerpted short story from Stories from the Warm Zone. And then after that, the panel will have about a 15-minute conversation, and then there will be time for you to ask questions. So now I'd like to introduce Geordie Williamson and hand it over to him. Geordie Williamson is a publisher of Picador Australia. He's the former chief literary critic of The Australian and outgoing editor of Best Australian Essays. In 2012, he published The Burning Library, a collection of essays on neglected Australian authors, of which Jessica Anderson had a chapter to herself. Geordie, thank you.
It's really interesting what Laura was saying about place. And I don't know if you discovered this, Anna, in your rereading of Tirra Lirra, but her depictions of inner eastern Sydney, Potts Point, Lizzie Bay, are just one of the glories of that novel and one of the great depictions this side of Michelle de Kretser's Questions of Travel. I think, look, I'm going to read to you from my essay in The Burning Library, precisely because when I thought today, I think this was the most concentrated engagement that I had with Jessica Anderson's work. And it's not that Jessica is a writer who fades from view. Some of the authors in The Burning Library I cannot recall a great deal about, but Jessica sticks. And I think that the fact that there are so many of you here is indicative that it's not just for me, that she's a resonant figure in Auslit. Anderson was born Jessica Queel in September 1916 in rural Queensland. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Charles, a government veterinarian from a large Irish family, and Alice, an English mother. Laura, you will tell me when I get these facts wrong. You just put it. Both parents were left-leaning in their politics, and remarkably for their time and place, I ripped these off from the Fabricating the Self, the Barry monograph. We'll blame her, yeah. But interestingly, both parents were left-leaning in their politics and remarkably for their time and place avowed pacifist and atheists. The family moved to Brisbane in the early 1920s to the suburb of Yeronga near the Brisbane River. Artist Lloyd Rees grew up in a rambling Queenslander only streets away for the sake of the children's education. It was here that Jessica's father died when she was 16. Although notoriously reticent about acknowledging autobiographical elements in her work, as Laura's mentioned, Anderson explained in an interview that you don't make a character that hasn't got something of yourself in it. Pieces from her 87 collection, Stories from the War Zone, draw openly on this time and place, and of Nora Porteous, whose retrospectively unfolding life is the subject of Tirra Lirra, Anderson was more guarded, admitting only that she was within my range. Still, it is fascinating to note the rhymes in Nora and Jessica's experience when attempting to reconstruct the author's early years. What should be made of the fact, for instance, that riverside streets near Anderson's Yeronga home bear the names Tennyson, Lancelot, Merlin and King Arthur? I had such a good time with Google Maps writing this essay. In the opening pages of Tirra Lirra, a 70-year-old woman, Nora, returns to her childhood home in an unnamed subtropical town after decades of living in England. Hers is a prodigal's delayed awakening to the past, helped along by a case of pneumonia that leaves her bedbound and full of feverish memories soon after her arrival. Nora recalls her young self drunk on lines from Alfred Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. The lady is famously a weaver who, in Tennyson's version, lives in cursed isolation. I know I don't need to tell you this. At one remove from reality, so prefiguring Nora's own later life working as a dressmaker in London. Lying alone on the riverbank with her breast bared to the moonlight in anticipation of some imagined Lancelot's arrival. This not only a naively sensual act, but an effort to synchronise the abstract realm of art and poetry, that is, of beauty, with her mundane surroundings. And yet, Camelot Street turns out to be a real place just off the Brisbane River. It is Nora's experience that exists in the intangible territory of art. The event shows us how careful we should be in reading Anderson's life into that of her first-person narrator. It is the metaphor of a young, creative woman's desire to bring apparently incompatible aspects of the world into alignment that brings with autobiographical truth, not some ill-disguised recollection from the author's past. John Updike once described his creation, Rabbit Angstrom, as a version of the author who never made it to college. Nora is a portrait of Anderson who, unlike her creator, fails to realise her nature, a born artist, in Anderson's words, who lives in a place where artists, although they are known to exist, were supposed to exist elsewhere. In Nora, Anderson sought to create a flawed, what-if version of herself, a human declension from a more fully realised destiny, which then came to stand for Anderson in the public imagination. It was not a simple failure to preserve what she called her lovely privacy that galled the author, but the paradox of her achievement, a creation so convincing that it's assumed the self of its creator. Tirra Lirra was still a lifetime away when Jessica Queel, having briefly studied art at Brisbane Technical College, escaped from Queensland to Sydney in 1935, to the elsewhere where artists existed. In the decades that followed, Anderson married twice, lived briefly in England, raised her daughter and worked, adapting plays for radio and churning out short fiction for magazines and newspapers. Literary piecework paid the bills and provided certain technical satisfactions. But just as Rosalie Gascoigne's study of flower arranging led to those unique assemblages that made her reputation as an artist, a growing complexity in Anderson's pseudonymously published writings pushed her towards literature proper. They were bad stories, Anderson recalled, but the better they got, the more likely they were to be refused. They got better of their own accord, and then they started to be turned down all the time. The backhanded modesty of the explanation is telling. If Anderson's emergence as a writer was delayed by diffidence regarding her gifts, it was a caution that combined ingrained gentility and hard aesthetic sense. Elaine Barry reports that Anderson's manuscripts show evidence of laborious revision. She also records the author's disabling awe in the face of the great writers who filled her shelves. But it is the brilliant, eccentric figure of Henry Green who looms largest in Anderson's private pantheon. If I could choose which novels I'd like to have written, she said of Green, I would have chosen his, all of them. It was from the reclusive English novelist that she learned how to subordinate authorial presence to those of her characters and to allow her voice to contain a multitude of other voices without losing a tone that belonged to her alone. Where such self-effacement struck Green's contemporaries as odd or even masochistic in a man, the same approach naturally came to a woman long used to demurely surrendering self to other selves. Green taught Anderson how to turn a bygone virtue into a fresh instrument of her art. I think that I'll just cut to the end because there are so many things to say about the two novels that bracket Tirra Lirra that they really need to be dealt with separately. By those I mean The Commandant, one of our great historical novels, and The Impersonators that Laura mentioned before, which immediately followed Tirra Lirra. The whittling away of a writer's reputation is always surprising and a melancholy process. Today we praise Tirra Lirra with the guilty conscience of those who know that Anderson's name lives on in a work that did not wholly please her. Her stated preferences were rather for the fictions that brackets at arrival. But if we are left with only one of Anderson's voices, this is before The Commandant was reissued by Text Classics, I should say. Tirra Lirra's, if we're only left with one of Anderson's voices, it should belong to Nora Porteous. Tirra Lirra's heroine does eventually put away the many personae that stood between her and authentic engagement with some primary self. An unintended consequence of Anderson's determined privacy is that our curiosity has settled on the character that best approximates our idea of her. Yet it is fair to say that Nora's long odyssey, her search for a unified self, has its real-world counterpart in Jessica Anderson's body of work. She is a beautiful, breathing emblem of her maker, a young woman whose skin suffered in the heat and who, on hot, bright nights, would smear herself with citronella, take a rug out into the lawn, and there allow her hatred of the ugliness around her, her fear that she might never escape it, be obliterated by the thick brilliance of the stars. The romance of the picture should, however, never make us forget that Anderson did make her escape, and that this freedom was won in the teeth of considerable personal difficulty. Beneath Nora's adolescent illusions lurks Anderson's implacable drive to write, the same undaunted energy that inspired Elizabeth Joly to clean the houses of Perth's rich so she could type at the desks of their empty apartments, a burglar of the imagination. In this sense, Anderson is closer to her final creation, Cecily from One of the Wattlebirds, yet another young woman who sets out to extract truth from the fictions on which her life is built. It is Cecily's words, almost the last of that novel, that belatedly sum up the combination of patience and ruthlessness that made Anderson a true writer at last. I would take refuge under their compulsion and meekly accept their strictures while my coming intention ticks secretly on in another place. Thank you. Now, next up, I'm not sure who's first. Pip, the wonderful Pip Smith, author of the magnificent novel Half Wild, is going to come and read to us.
Hi, I'm reading one of these autobiographical short fictions from Stories from the Warm Zone. This story is called Against the Wall. F's and S's were the worst, but I was sure I remembered a time when even they came unimpeded from my mouth. My stammer was one of the many things not mentioned in our family, but I often pondered it in my mind. It baffled me so much that at last I went to Rhoda, who was 6 years my senior, and asked if it had begun after I had that fall from the ladder that propped against the wire enclosure of the half-built tennis court in the park. Rhoda said she was pretty sure I used to stammer a bit at Old Malulabin before we moved into the suburbs and became acquainted with such things as tennis courts and parks. I asked Sybil, but she, close to my own age, remembered no more than I did. But when I asked Neil, the eldest of us all, he replied reluctantly that yes, if I must know, I was already stammering a bit before we moved into the new house, and that the best thing to do was just to ignore it. I went and asked my mother if I had been born with it. "Indeed you were not," she indignantly replied. She always resisted any suggestion that any of her 4 children had not come perfect into the world. "It's not a stammer at all," she said. "It's only a little hesitation. Ignore it and it will pass." I imagine us both standing in the radiation from the wood stove. I often approached her as she worked there because I did not want her undivided attention. I fiddled with the row of ladles and spoons and said, "Then why isn't it passing?" "Did you stammer just then?" "No," I admitted. "Well, you see." "But I do other times." "That's because you dwell on it. Stop thinking about it and it will pass." But I couldn't stop. It was so mysterious. I was puzzled especially by its long remissions. It would be absent for hours, even for days, and then suddenly there it would be, in response, I felt, to some emanation, either from inside myself or issuing from those I was speaking to. "What is it?" I would inwardly cry, while outfacing mimicry or commiseration. "What is it?" There was no reply. I tried to settle for the family attitude. Ignore it and it will pass. At home and with my friends, this was fairly easy. But at the ugly school across the park, it was considerably less easy. And when a new teacher, Miss Rickard, came into the classroom one day and took charge, it became impossible. Miss Rickard did not like teaching us. "Oh, you poor barbarians," or as you yourselves would say, poor. Sometimes she would take the class into her confidence. "I have travelled," she once loudly announced, "in realms of gold." She let her glance move slowly over us, showing incredulity at her own presence before us. She was short and slender, about 40, and wore interesting embroidered blouses and short, dark, knife-pleated skirts. The word-blocking emanation issued very strongly from Miss Rickard, or from myself in her presence. When called on to answer a question, I held up the class and diverted everyone's attention, so was excused from answering until, one afternoon, Miss Rickard happened to follow in the footsteps of myself and my friends, Betty and Claire, across the park. "You," she said the next day, "you can speak perfectly well when it pleases you. Now, stand up." I stood, the hinged seat clacking against the desk behind mine. I knew I was not innocent of provocation. It was likely that she had heard me asking Betty and Claire just to look at that poor little bird. "Now," said Miss Rickard, "you will kindly answer this." As I struggled and hissed, the class grew restless. Some giggled. "Very well," said Miss Rickard. "Perhaps tomorrow you will change your mind. Now please go and stand against the wall." Miss Rickard did not give cuts, but used her cane only as a pointer. She told us she would not demean herself by giving us cuts. For a week or so, Miss Rickard would challenge me to answer a question, and a few minutes later, there I would be, against the wall, wiping with the sole of one sandal the timber on which the feet of troublemakers had left a row of marks like the shadow of darkened teeth. Then, for days, perhaps for a whole week, she would suspend the challenge, and I would hope that she had understood or had forgotten me. Now I think it likely that she herself was sick of it, worried by it, and wanted a rest. In any case, she would always return to the attack. "Come along now. Stand up and give us the answer. We all know you know it." I can't imagine why Miss Rickard believed I had devised this torment for myself, nor why she persisted in her belief and kept us locked in a struggle she was doomed to lose. For as I stood and struggled to speak, the former emanation came to seem like a substance, visualized by me as a tangled mass of some sort, spiny, prickly, or a forward-inclining jagged rock which blocked at last even the contorted sounds I had managed before. I think she did suspect then that speech was truly beyond my control, because she spoke to me, less curtly, of willpower. But that exhortation did not help either. Somewhere in Australia in the 1920s, there may have been parents' associations, but I have heard of none in Brisbane. On the contrary, parental intervention was considered very eccentric and was dreaded by the children themselves. At the Nitty school Neil and Rhoda had attended when we lived on Old Malulaben, our father's intercession in school affairs had resulted in daily taunts from the other children that Rhoda and Neil had a mad father. The Nitty school was one of the reasons my mother had advanced for moving from my father's childhood home, and I now often heard her commend the ugly school across the park, saying with the utmost confidence that it was one of the best schools in Queensland, and my father would agree, replying, in that respect at least, the move had been a success. Sybil, 2 classes above mine, did not complain, and Rhoda had had an uneventful attendance there before going on to high school. So that left me. Only me. My troubles must be my own fault, in accord with my other transgressions, such as arriving late in class, going to play with the poor kids at the creek, smoking Betty's father's cigarettes, and stealing threepences to buy pies from the pie man who came to the school in his painted cart, ringing his bell every lunch hour. I'm not sure how my parents came to hear of my trouble, but as it was only a few days after their headmaster came into the classroom and found me against the wall, I think he must have summoned my mother by letter to the school. I heard of it only when Betty and Claire, as we set off one day for home, whispered that they had just seen my mother going with Miss Rickard into the headmaster's office. I gasped, and we all 3 tried to think what I had done. I could only think of the pies, which my mother said were nasty, unhygienic things on no account to be touched. The next morning, I stole a packet of dates from the pantry, and instead of going to the school, took my satchel and lunch to the forbidden territory of the creek.
Those of you who read Karen Lamb's biography of Thea Astley will recognise some similarities there. School in Queensland during that era was obviously a special experience for those wrong box types. One of the joys of coming to an event like this is to see the kind of reverberation in genealogical terms that Jessica's writing has had. And just an honour to be seated between 2 such figures as Anna and Michelle, who are both obviously eminences and dynamic people at the pointy end of Australian letters right now. Michelle hates it when I say nice things about her work, so I'll simply say that she's a novelist you probably happened across, and it's great to have her here.
Thank you, Geordie, for that admirably brief introduction. I wish they were all like that, actually. And thank you, Julia, for inviting me to be part of this panel, because it's lovely to have the opportunity to express publicly my long-standing admiration for Jessica Anderson's work. I'm talking today about Sydney in the fiction of Jessica Anderson, and I want to begin my consideration of that subject by acknowledging how grateful I am to Anderson for her depiction of this city over the course of several books. When my family migrated to Australia, we lived in Melbourne. Like Anna, I'm an escapee. It's probably not a coincidence that we end up. Anyway, there was no money for travel. And for many years, Sydney remained for me a city of literature, one I discovered in fiction. It is artists, visual artists, filmmakers, writers who lift places into mythology, who show us that our surroundings are worthy of art, which is, of course, particularly important in a country which is relatively underrepresented in that domain. And we are all, as readers and writers, indebted to Anderson for her wonderfully rich transformation of Sydney into fiction. And the rest of what I have to say is really just a series of observations which I'm offering as starting points for discussion. The first thing is that I'm really struck by the contrast between Brisbane and Sydney as depicted in Anderson's fiction. When Nora, from Tirra Lirra, looks at her childhood home in Brisbane, she says, I quote, "a heavy wooden box on legs." Well, what is a wooden box on legs? It is a cradle and it is a coffin. And that's what Brisbane stands for, I think, in Anderson's fiction. It's the place where you begin and the place where you end, the womb and the tomb. But life, lovely, faceted life, is lived in Sydney. Anderson's feelings of Brisbane are complex and equivocal, as our feelings for the places where we come from often are. And although it's outside the scope of this talk, I would just gesture towards the representation of the fledgling colony in the wonderful novel The Commandant, the colony that will become Brisbane, and which is a hellhole. Whereas Anderson brings to Sydney the affection and admiration we feel for places we discover. My second observation is that Sydney stands for modern life, for modernity in Anderson's fiction. It's no accident that her first two novels, both set here, may be broadly categorized as crime fiction. I'm sure Geordie will contest this vigorously. But I say it, broadly categorized as crime fiction, a genre synonymous with the mean streets of modernity. And I'm interested in Anderson's claiming of that representational space. In an interview she gave much later in life, she mentions how difficult it was for her to find a foothold in Australian literature, which, when she was a young woman, was still monopolised by fiction about the bush, a space perceived as quintessentially male that left little room for the representation of feminised experience. In setting her early fiction in Sydney, Anderson is asserting the importance of the city in Australian literature, which still required nerve in 1963 when she published her first book. My third point is that the Sydney Anderson is interested in, as Geordie pointed out, is modernist Sydney, the Sydney that flourished between the wars, the Harbour Bridge being, of course, the iconic symbol of that era. This is the Sydney that Anderson first encountered when she moved here, aged 19 in 1935, here being specifically King's Cross, which she described as the only bohemian centre in the country at the time. Behind Nora's loving evocation of this Sydney in Tirra Lirra, we can surely glimpse Anderson's own sense of the harbour city's expansive and joyful possibilities. And here I would say that while its articulation of female experience is a great achievement of Tirra Lirra, if I'm to be honest, I must say that what has always haunted me isn't Nora so much as the city Anderson describes. I had read other novels set in Sydney, novels by Patrick White, by Christina Stead, by others, but their characters, and in fact their authors, took Sydney for granted. As an outsider myself, spellbound by the charms of the harbour city, it was Anderson's narrative of blissful revelation that resonated with me. But, as Nora in Tirra Lirra wisely remarks, when one falls in love with a city, it is always only with part of it. And she tells us that her Sydney, Anderson's Sydney, is bounded on the north by the harbour, on the south by Bayswater Road, on the west by the city, some of which it included, and on the east by Beach Road at Rushcutters Bay. So that's a pretty compact area. And what is noticeable is that it's an area packed with apartment buildings, a relatively new phenomenon in Australian cities dating from the 1920s. The thing about an apartment, as against a house, is that the mansion flats of Potts Point notwithstanding, apartments provide a setting for that then modern phenomenon, the single working woman. In several of Anderson's novels and stories, a female protagonist, unencumbered by family, lives in an apartment. Again, we're dealing with modern, feminized space. This is the Sydney of Grace Cossington Smith's paintings, her famous paintings of the bridge, of course, but also of street scenes and cafe interiors. Like Cossington Smith, Anderson is creating something fresh and new, the world of female urban experience of women in the city. She is not alone here, of course. There is also the work of writers such as Christina Stead and Eleanor Dark, and perhaps most pertinently, the fiction of Elizabeth Harrower. Think, for instance, of Down in the City, set in an apartment in King's Cross. All these women writers were claiming fictional space for this new world in Australian literature. My next related point is that when she leaves the boundaries of her Sydney, Anderson is considerably less taken with the city. The North Shore is just acceptable. It's described as clean in The Impersonators, which is set partly in Wahroonga, and it's a good place to bring up children. This is damning with faint praise indeed. But the northeasterlies, which stir the soul and set one dreaming of travel and movement, don't reach here, according to Anderson. The rectangular house block prevails, despite the softening greenery, and rectangles are a pretty dreadful thing, in Anderson's view. They crop up elsewhere too. The goals of people living on these blocks are dismissed as timid and second-rate. She's a writer with bite, Anderson. So, the North Shore is dull, domesticated space that represents the anchors of marriage, family, and children, in contradistinction to the turbulence and romance of the Cross. By the time of One of the Wattlebirds, her last novel, Anderson's protagonist has kept pace with the times and is living in Annandale, in a flat, of course. But generally, Anderson has only scorn for the city's west. Burwood, for instance, is populated by vulgar people who wear floral nylon. The suburb is flat and laid out on a grid. More of those reprehensible rectangles. I can only hope she never went to Melbourne, really. Worse still, the streetscapes of the West are blighted by what a character in The Impersonator calls the double-fronted brick bung, the curse of Sydney. He goes on to pretty much describe the house I live in. The curse of Sydney, as I now call it. That character is a real estate agent, and Anderson displays considerable interest in domestic space and the built landscape in her fiction. I was interested to learn from Geordie's essay that she had wanted to be an architect. It shows, I think. And she's one of the great observers of streetscapes, of the way streetscapes and atmospheres change from one part of the city to another. I see this partly as a newcomer's preoccupation with classification and delineation, with safely navigating new territory by mapping its shifts and variations. And finally, I would remind you of that moment in The Impersonators where Anderson draws our attention to the proximity of the North Shore and Inner West train lines at Wynyard. These two sets of tracks one on either side of the same platform, heading for different destinations. North Shore, West, saved the damned. Function is emblematic of social division in Australia. So to end with, I would suggest that while Anderson is fascinated by the way the geography of Sydney, its hills and plains, its promontories and harbour, the geography creates different territories within the city, she is also aware that these various Sydneys are inescapably bound up with money and class. Thank you.
Say the other person who popped into my head when you were talking, and the other novel, was Sumner Loch Elliott and Water Under the Bridge, a gay man who found the freedom in that same space. I think that idea has legs. Well, it is a great honour indeed to welcome Anna. Anna needs no introduction because I no doubt all of you have read her non-fiction and her fiction and found it splendid, as I have. So, all yours.
Thanks again for the brevity, Geordie. That's great. I'm very happy to be here. It's such a lovely occasion to honour Jessica Anderson in such wonderful company. I'm going to read from when I was living overseas in New York a few years ago. I was asked to write an introduction to Tirra Lirra by the River because a Brooklyn publishing house called Melville House was bringing out a new US edition. And I don't know how they got hold of me. It seemed, I thought I was well hidden, and but it seemed that the novel had meant a lot to me, and so it sort of seemed like fate, and I said yes. Only I wouldn't write an introduction because I felt that when I open a novel, I don't want to read somebody else. I just want to read the book. So I said if I could do an afterword, I would, and so I did. And it was republished by Meanjin last year, so it's around and available, and I apologise to people if you've read it before, but I've cribbed from it to talk to you today because I thought if I did it off the cuff, it wouldn't be as good, really. So the piece is called Who Do You Think You Are? First, a confession, and it's just about Tirra Lirra, so I'm not going, even though I'm a refugee from Melbourne, I'm not going very broad. So my confession, I'm not coming to this novel fresh as an adult reader with some kind of hard-won sense of self from which to survey the world. I read Tirra Lirra by the River at school 30 years ago. It entered my blood in such a way that I cannot remember a self before this book was part of it. From the vantage point of now, it seems to me that the ages of, say, between 13 and 23 are particularly dangerous in a duckling kind of way for the retaining of impressions, the setting of patterns, which are then apparently instinctively followed. We form our tastes, especially literary and sexual, by what we come across or by what comes across us in those years. And although this dangerous decade can seem like a time of unbounded possibility, most of life, after all, being still to come, these are also years in which some of the imprinting is of limits to our sense of what is possible. Tirra Lirra by the River is a novel that examines in brutally, beautifully honest detail the patterns etched on a soul at this formative time. And it shows how, late in life, however well or however badly you might think that has turned out, there may be some satisfaction to be had by recognising the patterns and what they have made of us. Nora is an old woman who has come home, and she's looking for what it was that made her, and trying to account then for what she made of herself. These are confronting questions to unravel, and ones that the novel, in some small way, also poses for me. In the mid-1980s, Tirra Lirra was a set text for secondary students in Melbourne, along with Christina Stead's masterpiece, The Man Who Loved Children, and Carson McCullers' sublime, The Member of the Wedding. When I reread them now, I see that they are a trifecta of high art and terror and truth, almost too powerful to give to teenagers, which is exactly to say what they most crave and need. All three books are about extraordinary teenage misfits, the genius Louis and the freak Frankie, who inhabit the extraordinary writers, Stead and McCullers, and Anderson's Nora, wry and brave, weaving her magnificent, truthful fictions. I spoke with Laura actually when I was writing this introduction, and she told me, as she mentioned today, that her mother's own belief was that truly terrible subjects become bearable to us in art because art itself, the beauty of form, offers a kind of consolation. Still, a small part of me, perhaps the part that is now the mother of teenage girls, does wonder if this stunning, toxic cocktail that formed me was not too strong. Did it feed a monster, comfort or encourage something that should have been put in a sack and sunk? Who knows? Life, especially a single life, is both the control and the experiment. What did they think would happen to us back in a suburban girls' school in the lost, pre-grunge, hair-gelled 1980s? I've no idea what I would have been like without these books, except more lost. But why did this novel mean so much? After all, it was about the struggles of a woman to live a life in which she can create works of art fully 70 years earlier. Hadn't the world changed radically for the better by the time it was published in 1978? We'd had another wave of feminism in the Western world, and in Australia the extraordinary Whitlam Labor government's social reforms, universal free healthcare, free university education, no-fault divorce, the single mother's pension, the establishment of the Australia Council, Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, and so on. Even as a teenager, my dim and kind of narrow world, I knew I was a beneficiary of this. I could get sick, educated, divorced, raise my children alone, and have all my future novels, so I thought, funded on the public purse. Except, as it turns out, for two eternal difficulties, sex and art, the very difficulties that Tirra Lirra is about. When my worst expectations are met, Nora Porteous confides in the first pages, I frequently find alleviation in detaching myself from the action, as it were, the better to appreciate the pattern of doom or comedy, or whatever you like to call it. What if we liked to call the pattern of doom or comedy or whatever a novel? Indeed, this novel. Tirra Lirra by the River is an intricate tissue of reminiscence woven by an old woman as she examines her life, pulling threads through it and tying ends to their long-ago beginnings. As Nora is someone compelled to make things, beautiful, useless things, but things the making of which is absolutely necessary to her, her struggles are the struggles of an artist. There are two of them. First, to find some form of life which allows her to work and have a personal sexual life, not easy for anyone, especially a woman, and most especially a woman of Nora's time. And then there's a struggle involved in the act of making itself, of imposing form on the material, finding the pattern of doom or comedy or whatever in it. Looked at in this way, Anderson's novel is an enactment of what it is about, as, more obviously, say, Ian McEwan's novel Atonement is itself an act of atonement for its narrator, or perhaps in a self-referentially startling way that an Escher drawing is a drawing of the hand that made the drawing. In the act of making it, we are in the narrator Nora's mind as she makes her work, and we discern, or we imagine we do, the Escher-like hand of Jessica Anderson enacting her own much more successful struggle and producing this book. The satisfactions or consolations of art in Tirra Lirra by the River are profound. Possibly they are so profound that they can distract us from the story itself, a story which, on one reading at least, is a tragedy of what she calls vile wastage, the waste of an artist's talent. Nora is cursed by wanting life and art, both. Desires that in Brisbane in the early 20th century could not speak their name, and that are probably pretty difficult to reconcile without a lot of collateral damage in any life. Indeed, as I write this, in time bought from a babysitter, bargained from my husband, and stolen from my children, the risk of collateral damage feels closer than I'd like. And yet, although I have read my Anderson and I know the risks, what I find myself most wanting right now, this is in the moment of writing, is a nice high tower, just like the doomed Lady of Shalotts, all of my own. The question of what one might reasonably want, the tailoring of desire to social limits, runs through the book as it runs through all our lives. And those limits are policed with a question muttered about Nora. Who does she think she is? This is a question of multi-purpose violence, which can be applied with equal ease to artistic ambition as to sexual desire. This is how it works with sex. When Nora is in her teens, a group of boys, polite when alone, rapacious as a group, try to grope the girls, who are varying degrees of willing. This is what the girls say to her when she says she doesn't want to come. What did you come for then? This is Nora. I saw sense in the question and stopped going. Those girls who continued to began to treat me with enmity, and for the first time I took note of an ominous, growled-out question. Who does she think she is? I'm disturbed by the extent to which Nora's girlhood, 70 years earlier, resonated with me in the 80s. We are led to believe that sex had been liberated fully a generation before, in the 1960s, but like all regime change, the results of the sexual revolution were more uneven than advertised. In the 1930s, Nora's husband at first called her frigid, and then, when she starts to get pleasure from sex, a whore. I remember similar kinds of sexual shunning applied to girls, when the slippery slope from frigid to cock tease to slut was vertiginous and absolute. You could be shunted from one category to another without, for your trouble, having had any fun at all. And I remember the policing question too, muttered most often by other girls, not directly to you, but deliberately within your hearing. Who does she think she is? In fact, the question was so brutal and basic, it could be asked without words at all, just by a look. When I was a teenager, powerless myself and trapped in a maze of strict expectations, spoken and unspoken, it was Nora's entrapment I noticed most. But what shocks me more now is the corrosive effect of her passivity, and the way, as she says, that much of my life can be apportioned into periods of waiting. This passivity, along with the persistent underestimating of her own talents, combines to concoct a trope so perniciously feminine that to write of it even now feels like naming a curse. When asked if the backbone of the novel were to her, quote, the plight of the unrecognised artist, I was wondering whether that might have been in what we heard today. I don't know that that was Beata Josefi. Whether the backbone of the novel is the plight of the unrecognised artist, Anderson describes a plight more fundamental, and this is Jessica Anderson. She said, not an unrecognised artist, but a person who is an artist, but doesn't succeed even being conscious of being an artist. She had, this is of Nora, a kind of buried talent, buried in herself. The sewing, the tapestries, had to be something acceptable to her society. She wasn't a strongly original person. Not many of us are. Anderson. If you are a born artist, can you survive if you cannot make anything? The making of things is necessary for artists of any medium to find their way in the world. There's no other way to understand it, nor to redeem our voucher for time on earth. If Nora isn't making something, she's not really alive. And yet, when old Nora is presented on 3 separate occasions with embroideries she made all those years ago, her tone changes radically. Gone is the diffident underdog, replaced with the confident, gimlet eye of an artist critically evaluating her work. Each time the tone shift is so radical, it feels as if the fabric of the novel tears a little, revealing, Escher-like, the hand of the artist behind it. When presented with the embroidery, old Nora is, quote, so astonished by the excellence of the design and the beauty of the colour, she can't speak. She wonders, who knows what else she, talking about herself, may have drawn out of the compression of a secret life. So the possibility of regret for an artistic life unlived is unspoken and terrible. But at the same time, this is Nora's victory. She pulls something out of what looked like nothing. Though, in typical fashion, Nora can't utter the words, even to kind, perceptive Betty Cusk, who's looking after her, because to do so would be to admit to having had an ambition. An ambition, like the Lady of Shalotts, to be both in the world and in the artist's tower, using it as material. Then, as now, this would be to court psychological and financial danger, and it may also be to bring down a curse upon your head. I didn't consciously think about this book for 30 years, but as Nora says, this is Nora, I did not know that such infections can enter the blood and that a tertiary stage is possible. I wrote a novel with a wry old narrator who deals with her Australian carer in the present tense while re-examining and reassembling the puzzle of her past. There are words, scenes, and a whole tone of caustic hope-hedging that I can see now are shocking echoes of the pattern imprinted on me. Which leaves me, in the end, experiencing an impulse like an alcoholic at AA, who must go back through all their acquaintance and hunt them down on Facebook or in life and apologise for what they did when they were drinking, even if they can't remember what that was. Is it even possible to go back through all your reading and acknowledge what you took, even though you didn't know you took it? Possibly, my old woman narrator in All That I Am, Ruth, puts it better than I can. She says, some memories may not even be my own. I heard the stories so often, I took them into me, burnished and smothered them as an oyster a piece of grit, and now, mine or not, they are my shiniest self. The oyster no more chooses the grit that gets into its shell than we choose which books get under our skin. Nor, I suppose, can I be any more accountable than a bicuspid for the shape and colour of what I might, years later, cough up. And it is in this way, in the end, that I feel that though I did not steal anything, and I cannot give it back, what I can do is acknowledge, in gratitude and awe, what I owe. Or, as Nora has it, imagination is only memory at 1, 2, or 20 removes, and to know that is to repudiate those moves. Thank you.
I was so entranced by that beautiful revisitation of Tirra Lirra that I should have pulled you up slightly. So no, it's absolutely perfect. What we'll do is we'll start off talking, and you guys can jump in at any point if you want to interject or ask a question. Question's best. Yes, thinking about Ruth, it's extraordinary. It's true, isn't it? But the idea that you've obviously the Bondi Junction setting has that more. You've jumped Beach Road, so I think you're safe. The fascinating thing for me in the Burning Library were figures like Jessica, like Olga Masters, like Amy Whiting, like Elizabeth Joly. This idea of the late blooming female Australian writer. It's so pervasive, particularly amongst that generation, that it almost creates its own subset. And I wanted to talk to you two, who have operated both as early starters and as you know contemporary writers, who are probably it would be now that these contemporaries would be starting with their publishing careers, or even in a decade or 20 years hence. Whether you think that there is some advantage to be gained from the idea of being a late starter like Jessica Anderson.
Thank you. Well, I actually am a late starter, Geordie, that reassuring figure, a late starter. I was 40 when my first book was published, so I think for me there are two great advantages. One, purely practical, is that I had a life before I was a writer. I was an editor and a publisher. And although it's not actually going to be possible, but I always felt that I could go back to that if the writing thing didn't work out. So that was in itself reassuring. I had a craft behind me. The other thing, though, that I think is great for a writer is that you have many years of reading behind you. I was a late starter as a writer, but an early starter as a reader. And I think we all come from readers, right?
Well, you've worked both sides of the fence, because you started early in non-fiction terms, and then you took some time to write your first full-length fiction. And I wondered whether that was by art or by design or by the exigencies of family life that you describe.
I can't imagine. I mean, I try and do things by design, but I can't. It doesn't work. And I feel like you're asking me a question as if there's a plan, and there isn't. And perhaps it's particularly as a woman. I have 3 children, and so my writing is done around them and whatever stage they're at. So I kind of can't afford to have a plan, because then I would be in a constant state of frustration. So I don't know, I think you write when you can, and you write the books you have to, and probably for every book you're a slightly different person. So if I had started younger, it would have been a different sort of book, possibly. You talk about fiction and non-fiction. I would have liked to have written a novel at the beginning, and I tried to write Stasiland as a novel, but the exigencies of that material, I felt that I had no right to be telling these stories that weren't being told, that weren't mine, that should exist in the world as non-fiction. So, and then with All That I Am, it had to be fiction because everyone was dead and I needed to bring them back to life. So I just look at the exigencies of where I'm at and what I'm writing about and choose the form in that way. That's such a vague answer.
It makes perfect sense. But this notion, I think, when we look at Jessica's career of the writer as reader primarily, is signal in her case, because it was that reading of Henry Green, of Muriel Spark, of Evil and War, of Dickens, of Henry James. But it was also the fact she had to do a lot of piecework. And when you were talking, Anna, about the kind of the craft practice by Nora, I thought back to all of the radio dramas and the short stories that Jessica was submitting magazines. It's a great way to basically delay success by giving yourself enough time to have the water run clear. Is that how you see your editorial years?
Oh gosh. Again, I mean, I sort of agree with Anna. It's hard to one imposes false patterns on one's life the moment one looks back. And what did editing give me? Oh, really, it gave me a washing machine, really. That was,
But let's think about the gendered nature of literary achievement that we've inherited, say, from the modernists, where I was thinking about The Sun Also Rises for the first time in years this morning, and that idea of the early efflorescence of the male writer who writes the kind of ambitious first novel and then enters into a commanding sort of mid-career with the big books, and then there might be a dying off with a final efflorescence and the Nobel, and then they can drink themselves to death or commit suicide in some particularly violent way. But it seems to me for Jessica and for her cohort, the very way that you put a career together is very different.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I think really, being a woman marked those writers. Well, I think it still does continue to mark the careers of female writers, but sort of starkly so for that generation. Also, the difficulty, that we shouldn't forget, of just getting of any Australian writer publishing anything at that time. There was no Australian publishing. And what's sort of interesting when you list the writers whom Anderson was inspired by was, well, they are all British. And I remember Harrower saying that she had just never read any Australian fiction. I mean, there was Harrower, for instance, publishing things that would surely have been of interest to Anderson, and perhaps she had, sort of later in...
Jessica, I should say, she did read her White and her Stead, didn't she? But she said that she couldn't take anything from them. And
yeah.
I saw it as sort of evidence of a kind of maturity and hard aesthetic sense in hers, that she found her models. She said, these are my people.
Yeah. But it still means that she would have had very much that sense of being a pioneer when she was writing about modern life in Sydney.
I think of the first interior spaces that I came across in Australian fiction, which was M. Barnard Eldershaw. A house is built, and the idea that Eldershaw and Marjorie Barnard had to actually team up to write together because one of them couldn't do it. They actually needed the kind of mutual consolation and assistance. But Anna, because you were talking about family life, it's not just about the condition of being a woman. It's in Jessica's work. It's situational. It's about how we're constructed by our family life. So it's our brothers and sisters, it's our parents, it's those expectations and obligations that tie us, that make the self obviously a really elusive thing to be able to say, this belongs to me entirely. Is that something that you feel that you've also taken as grit for your shell?
Oh, that's such a good question. Just on the issue of Australian and other influences, that's a question that is a kind of, I think, has a sort of nation-building aspect to it. So it's as if we need to create an Australian literature that is our own and is different from looking to the UK or the US or whatever. And I completely understand that, but I also find it totally not useful because I have as much right to read any German, British, American writer and take them into myself as I have to read Anderson. I mean, it's those things that don't really... The national projects of all of those literatures are not useful necessarily to writers, And so, yeah, I would say that. On the self, the construction of the self, well, I think part of, say, a day like today to celebrate Jessica Anderson and to invoke all of these other brilliant writers, it's really important to place women writers in the centre of Australian writing. And because that is important for the women writers here in this room, just to think that you are central to the project of nation building or whatever it is, and not peripheral to the surf and turf blokes or whoever they might be, however good they are. The issue of, the thing about Tirra Lirra that's so wonderful and also terrifying is how do you maintain, as a woman with all of these enormous pressures and high expectations of kind of domestic servitude or behaviour on the one hand and low expectations of artistic talent on the other, maintain the kind of core confidence from which to decide that you have something really important to say and that what you make is going to be at least an attempt at being great. I mean, I think that's just an eternal issue for all artists, and it's an issue for women because they have possibly more pressures on them, which corrode that self or potentially corrode it, for sure.
I think that's a really profound point you make. My feeling has always been, I don't know about you all, but that if we're going to talk about canonicity, and let's talk about it in Anglosphere terms, those figures who are female writers who have survived in the canon are those who are very enduring, unlike many of the men who fall in and fall out according to the vagaries of the moment, because they've been formed under atmospheres of pressure. And you know that those 19th century English novelists, that Middlemarch is a book that will not go away because it was created, under many fathoms. But in terms of Jessica's own reputation, I wanted to ask you before we do open it up, what you think it is about a particular quality or flavour in her work that makes her an enduring writer, just in broad terms.
Look, I think the quality of her writing is just extraordinary. The sheer quality of the craft of the sentence is wonderful, and the articulation of female experience, I think, continues to resonate. I also think, the book for which she is remembered is Tirra Lirra, although she has, other excellent novels. And I actually think that's the reason for that, I think, is partly because of the moment at which it was published, 1978. I think that fits with what Anna was saying with that idea of nation building. So if you think about 1978, it's coming out of the Whitlam era. It's the moment when Oz Lit is kind of, really sort of taking off in not just in universities, but also with the general public, that there's suddenly a hunger for reading Australian stories. You think of things like Helen Garner's Monkey Grip, the 77, 78, around there. So, there's suddenly this sort of desire for, it's the moment where the Australia Council gets set up and artists start coming home, or at least there's no longer any necessity to leave. And what Anderson's narrative, and I'm sure this is sort of, subliminal, but it's the story of someone who goes away and is not a success, who is not a successful artist. And there's that sense that maybe if she had stayed home and worked on those wonderful tapestries, something would have come of it.
No, I think that point is germane when we think of someone like Elizabeth Harrower, who just published that little bit earlier and who missed that wave. And absolutely. That's her own, I've heard her argue that's why she felt that she never quite got that enduring support. And what about you?
Well, I find Nora's story, and the little I know of Elizabeth Harrower's story, how brilliant she is, and then she stopped writing for 40 years. I find those stories really terrifying because they occupy a place at which you've got, Nora's is fiction, and obviously Jessica Anderson's very beloved and successful and central to Australian literature. But Elizabeth Harrower, who kind of now is too, but just to the idea of needing some kind of support from your environment that you're not getting to produce is absolutely terrifying to me. Because I would love to think I don't need it, and that is totally not true. And of course, I'm not hard done by, and I don't think of myself as hard done by, but those really, really talented women who may not have had that, I don't know, I'm kind of, it's just terrifying.
Well, you didn't have to publish your first 3 novels in the UK because there was literally no one here publishing the kind of books that you wanted to publish. And that is a tribute to her and to Pam Macmillan Picador. Thank you very much. He says, taking the credit more than 40 years later. All right. Well, look, I'm sorry. I've been gibbering on more than enough. If anyone would like to ask any questions of any of us, please shout. There is a roving mic too. Susan was first. You can go next, Jane. You were half a second out.
I have lots of questions. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. But just wondering what the critical reception was of Jessica's books at the time. I mean, did she get that kind of support? Laura might remember. For some of them, was...
The problem was in the packaging.
Fantastic?
The problem was the packaging. So the first two were published pretty much as as crime novels, and so got brief notice.
I don't think An Ordinary Lunacy was published as a crime novel.
Sorry, as a comedy of manners, but both tended to fall into genre formats and get brief notice rather than a full literary review.
I remember the first reviews for An Ordinary Lunacy coming in, and of course everyone was I do remember the first reviews of An Ordinary Lunacy coming in, and it was published exactly as you say in England, because there wasn't an Australian publisher that Mum felt, I don't know, I think that you did think of going to England. I mean, it was almost automatic. And she was published by Macmillan, and she was thrilled to be published. It was just, very, very heady. But when the reviews came in, she had some wonderful reviews. The Times Literary Supplement reviewed her very, very well. I remember one review, and I used to joke about her being called Mrs. Forster, compared her to E.M. Forster, which, of course, she took as a joke too. But they were very, very good reviews. They didn't denigrate the book or sideline it. Maybe now they would have seemed too few and too not detailed enough, but then, no, she felt as though that was a thing, Anna, that did allow the environment, it created an environment for her to go on.
We should say that it was only the immense critical and commercial success of Tirra Lirra that led to republication locally of the first three, or was it republication in the UK of those earlier novels? So that's an important pivot point, isn't it? Jane, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you for the most extraordinary talks, all of you. Anna, I couldn't dare to ask about the terribly charged material that you raised about a woman and an artist. I don't know how I would make a question about that. But Michelle, and also by implication, Anna, because you raised the question of nationalism, I'm fascinated by the question of place and the fact that Jessica... Well, the questions of nation building. But I actually thought that Jessica found in Christina Stead I think I remember her saying that it was in the novels of Christina Stead that she first realised that you could actually write a novel and set it in Australia. Is that true? Does anyone know that?
I think that's right. I think that's in that interview that I was referring to.
Yeah, right.
About that when she was growing up, and Stead notwithstanding, and by this time, of course, Stead's gone, right? She's no longer in Australia, and she's no longer setting her fiction in Australia. That the dominant kind of novel on the literary scene was much more blokey and tended to be more rural.
Oh, absolutely. But that's why I'm sort of making the point that it was so important, notwithstanding where the influences came from internationally, to actually have an Australian scene that she could, place her novels in. But just quickly leading on from that briefly. So therefore I found it fascinating that you believe that Jessica makes such a more vivid picture of Sydney as an outsider than both Patrick White and Christina Stead, because I find them so vividly evoke Sydney.
Oh yeah, I do. I think I probably didn't express myself very clearly. They both do, and White in particular, simply because he has more novels set in Sydney. He writes about Sydney more frequently. But I think there is, Anderson's novels are these novels of arrival in Sydney. And even Sylvia in The Impersonators has come back to Sydney after a long absence in Europe. And as someone who was not myself a Sydney-sider, I was always, coming to Sydney, and it was that sense of revelation and opening up and possibility that resonated with me. This is not to say that Stead and White don't describe Sydney, but they describe it in a completely different way. They are insiders, they take it for granted.
Yes.
Hi. Just before we came in, a straw poll of 2 came up with The Commandant as our favourite, and it's a novel. So I just wondered whether you'd like to comment on it. I mentioned just because you were talking about nationalism and the male, and it's amazing when you think about the feminine reading and perspective she gives to the big myth stuff, you know. So I thought you might want to comment.
Look, it's my favourite too, I think. And what I love about it is the way that it plays off what we were saying before about the intimate, intricate, domestic, feminine interiority that she's attempting as an artist to body forth, and moving it to a space which is obviously fledgling, which is almost all outside. So here is this colony with a scattering of imperial infrastructure, with modest garden spaces, with women who must be kept indoors, withdrawn from a world that is full of nature and fearfulness. And it is almost like the women in this novel are the real convicts. They're the prisoners because they are not permitted outside of the walls and therefore not permitted to take part in the narrative that takes place, even though they're rich and complex and magnificent people. There was a point made in one of the essays on the Commandant that it's also a rare description of female passion for a man that really rings true and powerfully, that of the wife for the Commandant, who seems to contain within him all of the potencies and implacability and kind of gravity of the imperial masculine estate in which these women suffer. So I think it's a really powerful book. At the time, was it actually was it also well received at the time? Do you recall?
It was very well reviewed, and it was reviewed more here than the first 2 books had been. Yes.
Can you remind me when it was published, Laura? Is it early 70s, mid 70s?
75.
75. It's interesting. I mean, it's the last of her books I read because I only read it when it was republished by Text, and all hail to Text and their classic series. And the thing that strikes me about it is, how close it is in the depiction of this hideous violence that's going on, and then this kind of feminized, pretty orderly space. Even though it's sort of charged with fear, it's still very sort of, little haven of order and domesticity. How close this is to our images of concentration camps. With
Potemkin village,
yes,
of normalcy, of Anglo normalcy, in a sea of penal colony despair and extirpation of
yes,
Black Australia.
Yes, yes.
I did the introduction for Bring Larks and Heroes, Tom Keneally's own novel of transportation, which he, like Jessica, spent a long time sitting in this library doing primary research. And I think your mum spent, 2 years doing research on the... And so both these novels are obviously intensely wrought and intensely felt, but it's interesting to see in 72 the kind of reception that Tom Keneally's book gets, and even today that it's given great ticks, and I think justifiably so. It's a wonderful novel and a great novel of opening up a part of our history which obviously many resisted for a long time. I'm interested to see that it's taken us a lot longer to realise The Commandant is a book of equal power and force. So I think we'll have to wrap it up there because I've talked too much again. So I do apologise. But look, it's been just a great honour to have Laura here, and Pip, thank you so much for your beautiful reading, and to all of the people at the Writers Centre, and particularly to Anna and Michelle. And thank you all.
Geordie, Michelle, Anna, Laura and Pip. There are copies of the books of Jessica Anderson's books that are in print, The Commandant and Tirra Lirra, for sale in the bookstore, and along with copies of the authors and speakers here today, copies of their books, and they're right at the front checkout at the bookstore. So go off and buy lots of books. I hope this has inspired you to read, perhaps return and reread Tirra Lirra, but also to turn to The Commandant, The Impersonators, Stories from the Warm Zone. They are fabulous books and worth the joy they will bring you. Thank you.